Hello and welcome. Today we're going to cover a lot of ground. How the talks are going, whether we'd be better off with the US out of future negotiations, how the meeting of G20 leaders could influence the talks, what advice Australia can give other countries on deploying clean energy, and the value of having COP31 in 2026 in Australia and the Pacific. It's a wide-ranging episode, and that's because my guest today has a wide range of expertise. Richie Merzian is currently the Chief Executive of Australia's Clean Energy Investor Group, which represents investors in the clean energy transition. But he's also a former member of Australia's negotiating team, so he can talk about the COP from both sides of the fence, explaining what negotiators are doing and what the clean energy private sector can bring to the table. He's got some amazing insights to share, so let's get started. Welcome, Richie.
Thank you.
Can I start off by asking you, it's a question that I ask everyone, what are you most proud of in your working life so far?
I guess it does come down to the international work, and I'm most proud of being able to use my voice, both when I was negotiating for Australia and then outside, in order to shape how Australia engaged the world in actually pushing for more climate action. So using my voice to leverage the international space to push Australia to be a better climate champion.
It is a difficult role being a negotiator. I mean, I would be interested in your thoughts on that. It's a very intense time for people who aren't involved in the negotiations, but it must be quite an intense experience for the negotiators themselves. Could you give us some insights into how it all works?
Sure. And so the UN climate space is, I think you think about it as sort of three parts. The first part is the core function. It's the conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. They meet annually in order to assess how things are going and then to bed down further rules and policies in order to incentivize action going forward. And they do that by splitting up all the issues. So there's probably about 50 different streams of negotiations happening at the peak. And they have individuals following those different streams who are in charge of a particular issue. They get given a mandate from the government. You can move from here to here in order to progress this issue. So the issue is climate finance. You have a mandate. Australia could agree to this or this. Go in there and see if you can land that. And the aspiration is that you get into a room, you negotiate for 12 hours a day. You do that over the course of 2 whole weeks. And by the end of that, you've landed on a compromise. And everything has to be agreed by consensus. Every word and comma and bullet point by consensus across 195 parties. I think it might even be a little bit more than that now. A few more have joined. So that's the sort of mammoth task. And they're all interrelated. And so the dynamics of one negotiation will spill into the other. Nothing is agreed till the entire package is agreed. And countries often work in blocks as well. So then there's like pre-negotiation amongst your block of countries before you even get to the main negotiating room. So this is the giant sort of circus that takes place. And despite all these issues, you still get these amazing sort of pieces that come together like the Paris Agreement. So that's the vision. That's the negotiations. The second part is what we call the action agenda. That's everything that happens outside the negotiating room. That's where the observers, the industry, unions, and First Nations, a whole mix of people come together to also discuss what they want to do on climate change, to showcase their paths, to agree on new initiatives. Countries will put on pavilions, so you've got this whole sort of expo and energy happening alongside the negotiations. And then the third part is sort of everything that happens outside. There's a green zone the public can go to. There are rallies and protests and actions and all the kind of stuff that often will make the media. And these three things mix together. And as a result of the energy that's going into climate action, but also our inability to really nail that ambition, it's grown dramatically over the course of 30 years. And now is the largest international event that a country can host.
That's actually a very good description of it, Richie. Thanks very much. So let me ask you then, as a former negotiator, what are your observations on the state of play at the moment? We're midway through the talks. How do you see it?
It's tough. It's tough. So initially you had the looming shadow of the US presidential election, which happened less than a week before the COP kicked off. The US will almost definitely withdraw. That's certainly what President Trump did before, and this will do again. And in a negotiation, which is all about trying to leverage contributions from wealthy industrialized countries who have benefited from using fossil fuels. We've lost a major financier, and so it's a blow. Having said that, though, there's still been quite good energy, and things have been still constructive enough to get some progress over the course of this week, including on other issues like rules around carbon markets. That has been an outstanding issue here. And so there's some good energy, but the progress is still quite limited. There's still the usual argy-bargy around who should chip in money, around what kind of money it should be, around how big the quantum needs to be. So like there's issues around trying to bed down progress made last year. Last year, for the first time ever in 30 years, they finally named the villain. They actually said we need to work towards transitioning fossil fuels out of the energy system. So they recognize that we can no longer be fossil fuel dependent for our power if we're actually going to shift the dial. But there's been pushback on actually trying to bed that down at this COP, which is really disappointing. The mitigation and the language of mitigation is just not there as well. So the progress has been limited, but we had ministers flying in this weekend. Minister Bowen's arrived. He'll be playing a key role in co-facilitating the finance negotiations as well. So in a sense, you're bringing in the big guns. You're bringing in the ministers. The ministers have more room to move, obviously, because they're political decision makers than the negotiators do from their more narrow mandates. And that will hopefully create more energy, more authority to actually shift things along in the final run.
Can I ask you, as you did mention the US election, to me, it seems like the sooner they're out of it, the better. I mean, the nominee for the Department of the Secretary of Energy is a fracking fluid drinking complete climate skeptic. I mean, it seems to me if they were in, they'd just be nothing but trouble. At least out of it, they can't be meddlesome. They can be absent, but not meddlesome. What do you think of that view?
It is a view that's being bandied about. Well, the first thing to say is the Paris Agreement has a 1 year, pull-out period. And so they'll still be around for the next year. And right now you still obviously have the Biden administration's appointees and delegates here from January. That'll be Trump's. And so I guess we'll have to test both worlds out before they can actually withdraw. The US is in the last 4 years being quite constructive, so it will be a miss. But yes, if you're not going to come here with goodwill, and if you are going to wreck, and given this is a consensus-based process, you can do a lot of damage. So there is obviously some benefit to not having actors who are not acting in good faith part of the process.
This is it is being called the Finance COP, which to me really seems about making it the Fairness COP, because we do have a financial system that has completely disadvantages those nations, those people that are most affected by climate change. Although finance is the focus of this COP, there is also the G20 happening at the same time. If those G20 leaders, if you walked into that room and those leaders turned to you, Richie, and said, okay, what message do we need to send? What do we need to do at this meeting to make sure the COP kind of kind of delivers on finance.
Yeah.
I mean, what would you ask them to say?
What would I tell them? With that awesome power,
Yeah,
having
Richie.
G20 leaders listen to me. Yep.
Yeah.
What a dream for a negotiator or an ex-negotiator. I think there's a line through that you can get to. So 15 years ago, parties agreed to $100 billion that would be mobilized per annum of public and private finance that would be directed towards developing countries to help them with climate action, both reducing emissions and adapting to the consequences. Now we need to agree on what the next sort of range will be, post 2025, if you will, because it's been $100 billion for the last couple of years. Now, a lot of people just want a big shiny number, but that's not going to cut it, because the sort of old way of thinking, which is sort of the aid money from wealthy to poorer nations, is not how the world really works anymore. The definition of wealthy countries has been stuck in that definition from 30 years ago. We often talk about the annexes and Annex 2 countries. Basically, countries who were wealthy in the early 90s are no longer the only countries that are wealthy these days. And so there's a whole upgrade that we need to do to who should be contributing, what that finance looks like, because it's no longer just grant money, aid money that's going from a developed to developing. There's so much more in terms of leveraging public finance or private finance, using all these different financial instruments, getting the big multilateral development banks like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank to work better, and leveraging their capital, which, you can triple the amount of money they give out if you can actually work on their systems to improve them and leverage them better. And so there's, in a sense, layers of things that you can do. But look, at the first point, there will need to be at least $1 trillion mobilized for climate action. And then there needs to be ways that we can actually better use the existing financial banks to help. And then there's ways that we can actually better, increase the grants that are going as well, and the support that's going directly from developed countries too. So there's, in a sense, a few things you can tick off, but we do need another big number. We need better ways of doing things, and we need to increase the number of countries that are contributing as well. And my role as the CEO of the Clean Energy Investor Group is because there's obviously a big role for the private sector to play here in actually financing the clean energy transition. Last year, we agreed on a new renewable energy goal, the first time ever, that we're going to collectively triple renewable energy capacity by 2030 and double energy efficiency. And so now it's, how do we finance that? How do we make sure we can actually do that? We're kind of on our own journey in Australia. There's a lot more that we've got to be doing globally.
I'll come to the specifics of finance and energy, from the perspective of your current role shortly. But I did just want to elaborate, or ask you to elaborate a bit on that point about the issue of talking about finance now being far more complicated than it was a few years ago. When was it? When the 100 billion figure was set. I mean, one of the advantages of that is that 100 billion is a nice round number. Everybody can understand it. When you are trying to stitch together a new financial commitment, I imagine part of the challenge is telling that story and explaining it in a way that everybody can understand and agree to.
It is a serious challenge. That 100 billion goal, that was part of a quick scramble on the very last days of Copenhagen, which was seen as a collective failure because it didn't take everyone along that journey, and it had to be bedded down the next year in Cancun. In fact, it was Minister Combe, if we can all cast our minds back to 2010, who was co-chairing and actually landed that and played a key role there. And amazingly, it'll be Minister Bowen, if we do get to an outcome, who'll be bedding it down here. So Australia has constantly played a role in trying to make this work, because it's crucial for its neighbors in the Pacific. It's crucial for neighbors in Asia as well. But yes, a simplistic single number won't work, and the 100 billion has been difficult in the sense that it's public and private. How do you define that? How do you attribute that? And it also relied heavily on developed countries mobilizing. That base has increased. Should Saudi Arabia be a contributor now? Should China be a contributor now? Should Singapore or Korea? None of these countries were included back in the day, but obviously they're all wealthy. They're all in a position to assist now. And so what does that look like? It is a hard message. And if you look at the proposals that have been put forward, countries also want to see that they're going to benefit. So small and developing states, they want a certain portion clearly articulated for them. The least developed countries, they want it clearly. They want, we want 250 billion just for us. And so once you start piecing that together, it all looks quite messy. And there's about 33 pages of text and proposals that are being put on the table that is currently the draft. And it is certainly a messy draft. It is a huge challenge. I think part of it is saying, look, many of us will step up, will step forward, and here's the floor for what it needs to be. Here's the minimum number of countries that need to be contributing to it, but it needs to be more. Here's the type of instruments it can work. And here's the other players, the other multilateral development banks, the other institutions that can help. Here's how they're going to be upping their game as well. Hopefully that's what the package looks like.
Yeah. Okay, I will just ask you one more question about that high level about finance, because you are somebody who explains it extremely well. And it's really about, I have a question about the international financial architecture, the broader, outside what might happen at this COP, there's a whole lot of multilateral institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, a whole lot of other multilateral banks. And there's also scope to introduce other forms of levies, like levies on shipping or, aviation, all those kinds of instruments. Now, that doesn't all get done here, does it? That's sort of, or to what extent does this COP create the space for those kinds of discussions? And to what extent do those discussions get dealt with and actioned elsewhere?
So there is a lot more that can be done. So the multilateral development banks, so all the sort of Bretton Woods institutions, in a sense, the global support structures that are being built to assist developing countries on their path are a huge source of climate finance. And if you look at Australia, whenever it wants to increase its climate finance, it usually drops more money to the Asian Development Bank or to IMF, World Bank, and other institutions to really assist in that regard, because they've got the people and the means with which to do so. They reckon the multilateral development banks that they can increase to about 120 billion in terms of what they can provide. Lord Stern was part of a high-level expert group that looked at the climate finance needs and what needs to be done, and they reckon that they could actually triple that. Could be more like over 400 billion that they could be mobilized just from better using the existing financial structures that they have there, basically increasing their risk appetite to actually take on more of these projects, because they are quite well capitalized. So there's a huge amount of money that we can mobilize just in better using the existing systems. And I think that's a really exciting avenue if we can bed that down. So at the end of the day, just one kind of point to make here and why finance is so important and why this is a finance COP. Climate finance is the glue that brings these deals together, these UN deals at the very end. It is the trust that's built from developed and developing countries, that developing countries can then say, we are going to take on more climate ambition. We're going to do the heavy lifting to shift our energy systems, to leapfrog old technologies and go straight to things that might be a bit harder, because we trust that there will be the support to get us there. That's why these deals are so important. And where we're at in the big UN process is countries are now doing their homework on what their 2035 target is going to look like, the next nationally determined contribution. And that needs to be drafted by February, and collectively they will all be locked in at the COP next year in Brazil. We need to keep the world to 1.5 degrees of global warming. We're not on track. This next round of ambition needs to get us there, and climate finance is the bona fides on the table that's going to inspire that action.
Yeah, yeah. And hopefully that will fall into place. Okay, let's zoom in a little. You're here in your capacity as Chief Executive of the Clean Energy Investor Group. So your focus has been very much on energy and on finance, I guess, at a more granular level. Could you talk a bit about what's caught your attention on those two fronts at this COP? Both what you've learnt that perhaps you hadn't really taken on board before, and also what messages you've sought to convey in your meetings with others at the COP.
The UN presidency, in this case is Azerbaijan, has organized thematic days. And so we had a day of finance as a theme, and lots of events around that, and a day on energy. So we've had a really good amount of just conversations around what it needs to look like. Sort of two things have jumped out. On the energy front, a lot of countries are thinking seriously about how they scale up with urgency renewable energy, and they're coming across issues that Australia has dealt with in terms of dealing with high penetration variable renewable energy, trying to build out grids that are fit for purpose, how to structure storage alongside the additional generation, and how to deal with rooftop solar as well. So it's been really interesting to see that the journey that to some extent Australia's pioneered with 1 in 3 homes, with rooftop, with, at any, like what we're dealing with up to 75% renewables in the grid at any one time, are issues that we can help other countries with. We're in a really strong position when it comes to assisting the world with what their energy journey can look like. And also thinking about what kind of ambition we can add to that. So last year there was a tripling renewable energy ambition. This year there's talk about tripling renewable energy capacity, energy storage. And so what does that look like? And there's a lot of talk around how you incentivize long duration energy storage. Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister, was here in his role with the International Hydropower Association, talking about the role that pumped hydro can play as well.
Yep.
Really interesting sort of who's coming forward to really explain these and explore these. But the big message is that many countries are now struggling and tackling and exploring the challenges that I think Australia can help with. So it'll be good to see what Australia can do. And there are a number of Australians kind of assisting in that. And I think there's a lot more that we can and should be doing. On the finance side, the other message is that there'll be a lot more finance coming from the private sector than there ever was before. I think 15 years ago, developed countries, wealthy countries, governments had to do a lot of the heavy lifting in providing that finance. Now the economics are on the side of the private sector. We know what the returns can look like. We know how affordable that energy can be for the consumer. There is strong demand from corporates for PPAs for clean energy. And so the private sector will have a much greater role to play than they've ever played before, which is probably why it's a more complicated conversation around mobilizing finance, but ultimately one where there is more ambition built in.
Your members, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of your members would be international companies. Is that correct?
Yeah, most of them do have, internationally headquartered or are heavily involved across APAC and other regions. Yeah.
So they are navigating very different scenarios in different countries. So I understand that point that you're making about the numbers stacking up quite clearly in terms of investment, but countries do have these very different situations, each nation. And as we've just seen in the US, things can pretty much turn on a dime. A company's finding a way to navigate that. Of course, they can't have, nothing is certain in the world. But are you finding that your members are coming up with ways to navigate that uncertainty?
I think the short answer is yes. What's been interesting is, so just using your US example, I was talking to one investment company, and they're not my member, and they're not based in Australia, but they are heavily exposed in the US. And I was like, oh, how's that looking? And they said, look, there will be, we are looking with fresh eyes as to how we reduce our risk, and there will be a lot of capital that's invested in the US looking for a new home, which is, I think, a real opportunity for Australia. Because in the last couple of years, the Inflation Reduction Act has been hoovering up, using a US term, a lot of investment. But I was like, well, what are you going to do it? And he was like, we're not, like, we actually think that we could probably keep a whole bunch of our investments there, and there'll still be a few opportunities there. We just don't believe that Trump's going to do what he's going to do. And also, a lot of our investment is in Republican areas. And so we think that there's actually going to be a lot of stickiness to it. So it's just interesting hearing from their perspective. There'll be some that'll go, but there'll some that'll stay. And it's sort of this mixed bag, and it's jurisdiction by jurisdiction as to how it all works. One of my members was saying that working in Japan means that you're going to get low returns, but you just know exactly how the process is going to unfold because of how well structured it'll be over a certain period, which they'll deliver it on time and space. For Australia, we know what the benefits could look like, but the settings, the policy settings, the tax settings are really where a lot of frustration comes through in terms of, and we can sort of unpack that as well. But I think there's a means to look at Australia to make sure that Australia remains competitive, especially at a time now where could be more capital to attract to resist Australia on its journey.
Okay, well, let's go straight into that. You said policy and tax settings, and I guess to some extent I'm a little bit surprised about policy settings because we have a completely different policy framework than we had, say, 2 years ago. Tax settings, I know nothing about. I'd be interested to hear about. So could you elaborate on those two things? What needs to change on the policy front and the tax front?
So on the policy front, the first is sort of the medium to long term. We need to know what the market will look like. And by here, I mean the NEM post-2030. And we've all, run through the rigmarole of the different reviews that have taken place for what the post-2025 NEM needs to look like. We know that the government's thinking about running a post-2030 review, and we've seen reports that the Productivity Commission will take this forward. So hopefully that kicks off, because there's just a whole bunch of uncertainties. What will happen when the capacity investment scheme closes, which will be in just a short, 5 years that it'll conclude. So we need to get our medium-term settings right. It's sort of number one. Number two, the planning process, which is probably a broader way of looking at the policy settings. The planning process needs to be improved. At the federal level, the EPBC is not fit for purpose. We're not structured to, basically rebuild most of our energy generation, and to do it at speed and scale, and to do it through the existing planning processes at the federal level. And there's some short-term fixes that you can look at to what to do there. The Clean Energy Investor Groups, working with HSF, the lawyers, to do a review as to what that needs to look like. We've done the same thing around the New South Wales planning system and the Queensland and Victorian one. We'll hopefully have that report by the end of the year. So we'll have a lot more to say there. Both what are the short-term fixes, because we know that those reforms are probably not going to happen anytime soon, but also when we are going to reform it, what do those stage 3 reforms need to look like? So that's sort of another part of the picture as well. How do we make sure that the planning processes work? Isn't a place like New South Wales, which unfortunately came up with some improved guidelines just in the last week or two.
Yep.
It was taking 3 times longer. It was taking years to push through. And so it's great having the reses there, but if you can't actually get approvals, then your patient capital might not be so patient.
Well, that's interesting. Sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting you should bring that up because, in New South Wales, we've got the new planning guidelines. Victoria, there's a new speed pathway, And in Tasmania, I think that's also the case. I don't know about the other and I think South Australia, they've either got something similar in the works or they've already implemented, and also WA. Queensland, in fact, is about to go backwards. I think their minister, the Premier, has instructed the Energy Minister to, and I may be wrong about my interpretation of this, but my understanding is that they are going to unwind processes that simplify and streamline approvals for renewable energy projects. So you will have a backward step there.
Yeah, there's been a fair few changes in, and we'll see what happens in Queensland. The Treasurer, who's the Minister for Energy, said that they're going to keep to their emissions reduction targets into the 2050 and up to the 2035. And so let's see how that all unfolds. But we're certainly keen to continue to work in Queensland, and at least half my members have projects or either in the pipeline or assets already there. So there's certainly been some improvements and some further complications. There's a lot more that can and should be done. I mean, and so really that's what we're chipping away at. But it is about getting our policy settings right so that investors feel comfortable in putting this in. And the same goes for tax as well, which I mentioned.
Yeah, tell me about tax. What needs to happen there?
So on the plus side, you have the Treasurer saying that he wants to build a front door for investment into new projects that are going to deliver on the future made in Australia and the net zero transition. So that's a really great sign from Treasury that they're looking at how they can attract more investment, which we're going to need, not just about replacing, the electricity on the grid like for like with renewables, but it's, going 300, 400, 500% more so that we can electrify transport, so that we can electrify industry, and so that we can then feed all that clean energy into new exports. So there's a lot that can and needs to be done on the demand side to get us there. At the same time, Treasury is looking at how it might change capital gains tax for foreign investors that would make it less competitive to invest in Australia. And given, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of these investors are coming from overseas, like this is capital that's more willing to be more risky, certainly more risky than take on more risk than what a lot of local investors are willing to do. And that's what's really spurring on and getting renewable energy projects up to a point where then locals can take them on. And so on the one hand, you've got this incentive being built, and on the other, you've got some further barriers potentially being put up. And this is sort of the case, it's like a microcosm for a whole variety of things. You've got some improvements in one place, and then you've kind of got further barriers being erected other. And I think at the end of the day, we still need to work collectively on a whole of government position. We met with the Mission Control, which is a new outfit built in the UK that is solely structured to deliver on their renewable transition and their clean energy and their 2035 target, which is 81% they just announced. We're basically charged with actually working through the system and making sure the number one priority is building out the clean energy they need to transition their economy. When Chris started to head it up, and so he's coming with that very clear mandate to sit over the top and to say, no, the priority here is that we get that clean energy there. So yes, we need to do so, with all the right ticks and balances, but we need to do so at speed, and we need to make sure that we can do this across the board. It doesn't feel like we have the same kind of whole of government commitment that washes through all our existing systems to make sure we get there, which is why we're not on track right now to hit our 82% by 2030 target for clean energy.
I will just ask you just a final question, Richie. Could you tell me one fact that you wish more people knew as we push forward with efforts to make the world cleaner, greener, and better? What's one fact that you think if it was more widely known, we would put our shoulders to the wheel in a more concerted way?
Okay. Solving climate change is simple. That's what I think we often overlook. It's actually simple. We stop using fossil fuels, to stop digging them up and stop using fossil fuels, and we electrify everything.
Yeah.
And we power that with renewables. Like the technological equation is, in a sense, sorted. The finance will be there because the economics are on our side. And so all of our problems right now are problems solely within our wheelhouse in sort of the policy space, in the communications, and in the social license, all things that are solely within our wheelhouse in Australia and in other places to solve. And so if we bring that conviction and that drive and that collaboration to do it, we will do it. And that's what gives me hope.
That's a really good point. And I must say, what struck me is it sort of made me think, well, actually the barriers, no, they're not technological, which I kind of knew, but they're not really economic. It really is about fairness. And practically with no other issue do we have to face up to what's fair and what's not fair in that fundamental way that we do with climate change. And that's what will be, to some extent, perhaps what will determine whether we succeed or fail, whether we're committed to taking a fairer approach.
One more thing, I'd be remiss not to mention it. The Australian government's lobbying to host a COP in Australia in 2 years' time in partnership with the Pacific. The Australian minister flew to Azerbaijan via Turkey to meet with his Turkish counterparts who have a counterbid. Now, the Turkish minister tweeted afterwards that it was great to meet, that they're going to hold firm on their bid, but it shows the level of commitment that the Australian government's bringing. It has most of its Western allies, who are the ones who have to vote on this in the Western group, supporting its bid. It has the Pacific Island Forum leaders supporting the bid.
Yes.
But what is the most exciting thing is we haven't had a COP in the Asia Pacific, and sort of the eastern side of the Asia Pacific, I should say, since 2007 in Indonesia. And the opportunity to use it on our side of the world to work in solidarity with the Pacific, but also to look at how we transition Asia, where the majority of the world's emissions are, the majority of the world's energy is consumed, and the majority of the world's climate manufacturing takes place, I think is really exciting.
100%.
And that's what people are telling me.
Yeah.
They want to see it happen on our side of the world because they want that transition to take place. And Australia is well placed to once, for the first time in 30 years, actually put its hand up to host. So I think that we should collectively, those who want to see this happen, do everything we can to barrack for that to actually come through.
100%, Richie. Absolutely. I mean, and I guess we'll find out. We find out in the next few days how fruitful.
Look, I wish. I'm not sure it'll happen. I want it to be in the next few days, but it could also potentially be kicked down the road. If it is to next year, maybe when they meet again in Germany in mid-year at the intersessional, or maybe even at the end of the year in Brazil. But regardless, I think we should work towards as if we are going to host.
Yes.
And we should do everything we can to actually start thinking about what that looks like and how to showcase a very different version of Australia to the world than the one that it knew.
Yeah, that's a really good point to end on. Okay, thanks very much, Richie.
My pleasure.